Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
Keeping power in a single-party state. Mussolini and Castro. A single-party state is a state which is ruled by one single political party, often led by one single individual leader. The leaders of single-party states have often found themselves in a precarious situation. When there's no opposition to power, all the glory, but also all the failures, become their responsibility. Since most of these leaders came into power by taking it, there's always the danger that someone else might come and take it away from them again. Something must be done to keep the public happy, to rally the masses behind the leader, or simply to keep attention focused on something else, especially when things are not going well. The interesting thing is that most single-party state leaders, both individuals or a political group or party, seem to have followed many of the same methods. It doesn't matter whether the leading party is right-wing fascist, like the Italian fascists and German National Socialists, or left-wing communist, like the Soviet Union, China, or Cuba. The methods used to stay in power are often the same. This episode will investigate some of the methods used to stay in power, which have been used by leaders of two single-party states. The states are almost completely different. They have come about in different times, on different continents, and with political ideologies on the complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. The states are Fascist Italy, led by Il Duce, the leader Benito Mussolini, from 1922 to 1943, and Socialist Cuba, neighbor to the USA on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, led by Fidel Castro from 1959 to his resignation in 2008. The main areas of focus will first be how they each set off their regimes, how they dealt with the opposition, enforced coercion, and instigated propaganda to ingratiate themselves with the citizens. Next will be an investigation of how they each mobilized the masses and kept them loyal to the regime. And third will be an exploration of both leaders' use of foreign policy in order to secure their positions in domestic affairs. On the surface, the two regimes could hardly be more different, but their use of these political measures are strikingly similar. Both Mussolini and Castro came into power on a wave of popularity and support and did not need to threaten or cajole their citizens to a very high degree. Benito Mussolini and his Fascio di Combattimento, fascist combatants, had been invited into government in 1922 by King Victor Emmanuel III after marching on to Rome. There was no need to put force behind their position. Since 1861, Italy had had 38 ministries and the country was in chaos. The fascists gave the hope of action over endless debate and a promise to protect landowners and capitalists from a socialist takeover. The initial cabinet had only 4 fascists with 10 non-fascists, but in the election of 1924, the fascists won a massive victory, giving them 64% or 404 seats in the parliament. When Mussolini proclaimed that fascism was not anti-clerical against the church, Pope Pius XI put the Catholic Church on good terms with the fascists. The church believed that the fascists might wear uniforms and have a reputation for violence, but still they would protect conservative institutions such as the church. One event did stir people against the fascists. In June of 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, leader of the United Socialist Party, was abducted and stabbed to death by fascists. The Matteotti crisis was the lowest point for Mussolini during these early years, but he removed the most radical fascists from his party and was able to contain the crisis. In Cuba, Fidel Castro likewise enjoyed the support of the masses in the early years of his regime. He and his Fidelistas came into power in January 1959 when Cuban military dictator Fulgencio Batista fled from the country, leaving its government open. Castro had fought a revolutionary struggle for years and now enjoyed the trust and support from the Cuban population. In triumphant rallies in the capital of Havana during the first days of 1959, Hundreds of thousands came to take part in emotional mass meetings. The hope was that Castro would destroy the dominance of foreign companies and organizations whom Batista had allowed generous rights and privileges in Cuba. Among these were the American United Fruit Company, which owned large sugar plantations in Cuba, and the American Mafia, which ran the casinos and also an extensive network of prostitutes in Havana. So, contrary to Mussolini, Fidel Castro faced opposition from those who had benefited under Batista. 500 Batista supporters and officials of the regime were condemned to death by firing squad. Thousands of anti-Castro Cubans fled to the United States and there told about evictions from their houses and religious persecution. Already in 1960, Castro created the Committees for Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, which literally became local networks of informants, spying on their neighbors and reporting troublemakers to the government. From what we have just heard, both leaders had relatively little need for a direct elimination of an opposition. This is different from, for example, the young Soviet Union, where the Bolsheviks, the communists, initially had to fight a 4-year civil war against the Tsar's former supporters. Castro did execute hundreds of potential opponents, though, and created a network of informants to root out troublemakers. But Mussolini and Castro both enjoyed an initially large support from the public, which both in Italy and Cuba hoped that life under the new leaders would improve. It became up to both of them to convince their citizens that it would. Keeping up support from the masses was a primary focus in both regimes, especially when things were not going well. We see a striking similarity in many of the tactics used, regardless of whether the regime was right-wing or left-wing. Both Mussolini and Castro set out to militarize their societies, became involved in education and youth movements, influenced the religious establishment, and created cults of personality around themselves. In Italy, the fascists set up the youth organization ONB, the Opera Nazionale Balilla, in 1926. The creed of the Balilla shows the curious mix between politics and religion, with words such as, "I believe in the genius of Mussolini, in our Holy Father fascism." Italian history textbooks were censored from 301 to just one approved textbook. Castro intended to spread the accept of a revolution by establishing revolutionary schools, EIR, schools of revolutionary instructions, though mainly for students at high school or university level. University professors who did not applaud the Castro regime were fired, and in elementary school, the children were taught to obey the party, not their parents. The need of soldiers to protect and extend the socialist revolution resulted in Cuba ending up with 225,000 soldiers, 190,000 reserves, and a militia of 1.2 million. Out of Cuba's 10 million inhabitants, 1 in 10 were involved in some military organization. Regarding religion, Mussolini seems less successful than Castro, in that he never managed to completely subordinate the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church did openly support Italy taking part in the Spanish Civil War 1936-39, as it was a war against communism. Castro had a stronger need to suppress the Cuban Catholic Church. Communism is against religion. In 1998, Pope John Paul II paid a historic visit to Cuba, and Catholic services were again accepted by the regime. But in return, the Church validated the Castro regime, so it was not much of a victory. Both leaders created cults of personality around them, but they were very different from each other. Mussolini, as the leader Il Duce, was extrovert, portrayed as practically infallible, very masculine, and a great soldier. Photos of him were taken from ground perspective to make him look taller than his 5 feet 6 inches, and images of him in military uniform, excelling at sports and being the great statesman were common. The old fascist slogan, "Believe, obey, fight," was followed by "Mussolini is always right." Sadly, he ended up believing too much in this image of himself. When he was replaced and later executed in 1943, it came as a great surprise for him. Castro's cult of personality was less aggressive, but still very real. He appeared very humble, as a man who had done only what had to be done. Always in army fatigues, Castro too put an emphasis on portraying himself as a soldier. Where Mussolini would publicize his life and activities as much as possible, very little would be known about Castro's private life. Contrary to Mussolini, Castro chose to share his cult of personality with Che Guevara, the young, handsome doctor who had taken part in the revolution and then went on to other countries to help their citizens breaking free of exploitation. Some speculate that Castro deliberately sent Che to foreign lands to keep him from becoming too popular with the Cuban masses. Nevertheless, the image of Che Guevara as a romantic guerrilla fighter is kept alive to this day on posters and t-shirts worn by young people all over the world. As we now see, Mussolini and Castro used many of the same tactics in order to bolster their image. Influencing youth, changing the syllabus in the schools, and creating cults of personality around themselves helped to consolidate their regimes and to create a personal link of identification between the leader and the citizen. Where Mussolini appeared outgoing, public, and superhuman, Castro seemed more anonymous, almost as a regular man who just did what he had to do. Both mainly bore military uniforms. Castro has been more successful than Mussolini. Castro stayed in power for 4 decades, while the flamboyant fascist Superman proved too much for the Italian people after just 20 years. Using foreign policy to maintain support from the public at home was very normal in both fascist Italy and socialist Cuba. Both Mussolini and Castro faced severe challenges when their respective policies failed to make life better for their citizens. They both became involved in conflicts in other countries and both aimed at playing the great international statesman, but the outlook and specific aims of their actions are different. First, Italy. Mussolini wanted 2 things: to expand the Italian colonial empire, reviving ancient Rome, and to be known as an international statesman equal to the leaders of Britain, France, and the USA. The idea of empire was promoted during the Corfu incident of 1923, when Mussolini used the death of a few Italian officers as an excuse to occupy the Greek island of Corfu, and in 1935, when Italy conquered Ethiopia to include it in its African colony of Abyssinia. In both cases, Mussolini was able to play on the weakness of the League of Nations, and although trade sanctions were imposed, they did little to hurt Italy. This was partly due to Mussolini ending up in the position of mediating between Britain and France and Germany. He was central in negotiating the Locarno Treaty in 1925, in which Germany promised to respect the borders decided by the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles and earn great respect from the British and French governments. His biggest achievement was the negotiation of the Munich Agreement in September 1938, making Britain and France effectively handing over Czechoslovakia to Hitler. From 1936, his strategies had become more aggressive. Italy was the largest single contributor of soldiers and equipment to the fascist side of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 39. 50,000 men, 763 aircraft, 950 tanks, and 1,600 tons of bombs were given to fascist General Franco. Germany provided just 16,000 troops and the service of the Condor Legion. A series of pacts and alliances was signed with Nazi Germany, culminating in the Pact of Steel in May 1939, where full military support was pledged between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Shortly hereafter, Mussolini steadily lost ground in his relationship to Hitler, ending up with half of Italy being run as a Nazi vassal state from 1943. Playing the international card was a vital part in Mussolini keeping power, especially in the 1930s. In 1929, the economy crashed, and Mussolini's plan of a corporate state created only confusion, contradictions, and chaos. The 1936 policy of autarky, self-sufficiency, was partly born because Italy simply lacked the money to import things, but it was promoted as a preparation for wars and conquest. Already in 1925, Mussolini introduced the Battle for Grain, a campaign aiming to make Italy self-sufficient in grain. It didn't work, and Italy was never really ready for its wars. Nevertheless, the notion of war and conquest stalled the Italian public in any criticism of the regime and diverted its attention from declining living standards and organizational chaos. Fidel Castro's use of an active foreign policy has not been with the aim of creating a Cuban empire, at least not outspokenly, but in order to justify and extend the Castro Revolution. central for Castro's foreign policy was always a deep resentment to the great enemy of the North, the USA. Already from 1959, Castro began trying to extend his revolution to all of Latin America, making close ties with Venezuela, with Michael Manley in Jamaica, and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, to name but a few. When Cuba allied itself with the Soviet Union in 1960, and Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered on Cuba in 1962, Castro managed to give his country a much more central role in global politics than would normally befall a small nation of 10 million people. This also greatly bolstered his image in Cuba and in third world countries in Latin America and Africa. Like Mussolini, Castro was not successful in improving the Cuban economy. In 1959, Cuba had ranked as the 5th strongest economy in Latin America. In 1981, it was number 15. The trade embargo of the USA made Cuba dependent on Soviet products, and development in the Cuban society virtually stopped. Like Mussolini's battle for grain, Castro in 1969-70 instigated the drive for a 10 million tons harvest, this one of sugarcane. The target was not met, and Cuba was actually worse off than before. This was one of the reasons for Castro's renewed activity in spreading revolution in other countries. In May and June 1972, he visited Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. And in 1975, he sent tens of thousands of his own soldiers to help the Marxist MPLA party in Angola, Africa, to seize power. In 1979, Havana hosted the Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement, where Castro spoke to 512 representatives from 82 countries, among them the Viet Cong from Vietnam and the PLO from Palestine. The idea of spreading the revolution and of being part of a struggle between the exploited former colonies and the imperialist and capitalist rulers of the world helped to justify many hardships among the Cuban population. It also kept people too occupied to complain. As Castro's illegitimate daughter Alina has said, they are always inventing some motive in order to make the Cuban people think about other things that are not reality. It is all like a novel that you read until you suddenly open your eyes unless you die. As we see, Mussolini and Castro both promoted a very active foreign policy, although both their countries were relatively poor and underdeveloped. Both countries could not import goods they needed and tried to mobilize the public in campaigns for improving agriculture. When it came to extending the influence of one's country and oneself, Castro was much more successful than Mussolini, both at home and abroad. While Mussolini is today considered somewhat of a buffoon, Castro, on the other hand, is still considered by many people all over the world a true revolutionary who has fought valiantly for the poor and downtrodden until his retirement from politics in 2008. In conclusion, we see how two very different leaders of two very different single-party states used many of the exact same methods in order to stay in power. Both came into power riding a wave of support and popularity, but soon realized that this support was not going to last by itself. Mussolini militarized Italian society from the bottom up, creating youth organizations similar to the Hitler Youth, while Castro militarized Cuba supposedly to continue its revolution. Education and religion was affected, creating an ideological vacuum to be filled with political propaganda and the personality cults created around the leaders. And both Mussolini and Castro made extensive use of an active foreign policy in order to bolster support at home. In different times and different areas of the world, a right-wing fascist leader and a left-wing communist revolutionary seem almost shockingly similar. Why is that? Ultimately, the strategies are similar because both countries became single-party states. And leaders of single-party states know that if they're not vigilant, their power can be taken away from them. They cannot accept room for discussion, criticism, or even the possibility of thinking badly of the leadership, and thus must keep the population in fear, busy, or occupied with work for the greater good of the state. In the end, Castro proved much more successful than Mussolini, staying in power for 4 decades and spreading his image as a revolutionary fighter for the weak all over the world. While people have no trouble judging Mussolini, the opinion on Castro is split into that of the revolutionary hero and that of the dictator.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Los Perdidos. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.